Alright, let's dive right into this explainer on the Cold War. Today, we're unpacking a monumental 45-year strategic chess match that fundamentally rewired the entire globe and, to be completely honest, came incredibly close to ending human civilization. You see, right after the confetti settled at the end of World War II, a brand new tension started brewing. That grand alliance that took down Hitler, well, it was really just a marriage of convenience. And once that common enemy was gone, the world basically split right down the middle between the two remaining heavyweights. And that brings us to the core question we're answering today. How exactly do you have a 45-year global conflict that ultimately ends without the two main superpowers ever directly firing a single shot at each other? It's kind of wild to think about. As we go through this, we're going to see how grand strategy, intense psychological pressure, and some genuinely terrifying technology defined this incredibly high-stakes standoff, rather than traditional head-to-head combat. So right after that wartime alliance fell apart, we're left with two entirely incompatible worldviews. On one side, we have the United States. They're wealthy, their mainland is basically untouched by the war, and they're aggressively championing capitalism, free markets, and democracy. Then, on the other side, you have the Soviet Union. They are heavily battle-scarred, pushing a state-controlled economy, collective ownership, and a strict one-party system. Each of these superpowers looked across the geopolitical chessboard and saw the other as an absolute existential threat to their very way of life. Now, take a second to just wrap your head around this number. 27 million. That staggering figure is the number of Soviet lives lost during World War II alone. When a nation loses that many people, it completely rewires how its leadership views the outside world. For Joseph Stalin, this massive trauma fueled a deeply paranoid defensive strategy. He honestly believed the West was out to destroy the Soviet Union. So, to protect the motherland, he felt he absolutely had to install friendly puppet governments all across Eastern Europe just to act as a physical buffer zone. Which leads us to part one of our breakdown. Containment and the curtain, marking the first major strategic phase of this conflict. Winston Churchill captured this moment perfectly when he declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. It's such a brilliant metaphor for what was happening. Europe was literally splitting in two, being sealed off behind rigid ideological and political walls. As power vacuums opened up in places like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, they were rapidly filled by Soviet-backed communist governments, all held in place by the looming presence of the Red Army. So, how does America respond? Well, they formulate what becomes known as containment. The crucial thing to understand here is that the US decided not to fight the Soviets head-on in the places where the Red Army was already entrenched. Instead, they essentially drew a hard, unyielding line in the sand to halt any further expansion. The strategy was basically, okay, keep what you have, but you will not spread a single inch further. This containment strategy got its first massive test in Germany. At the time, West Berlin was a democratic island completely surrounded by Soviet-controlled East Germany. In 1948, Stalin tried to squeeze the West out by blocking all the roads, cutting off 2 million people from basic survival goods like food and fuel. But instead of rolling in the tanks and starting World War III, the West launched the Berlin Airlift. They flew planes around the clock, dropping food, coal, and literally dropping candy from the sky. It was a massive strategic and PR victory. Eventually, Stalin realized he couldn't win this way and just lifted the blockade. Containment worked, and nobody even fired a shot. Moving on to part two, we hit the domino theory effect, where the fear of expansion really shifts into overdrive. As the map started changing, a terrifying new doctrine took hold of American politicians, the domino theory. The idea was simple, but incredibly dangerous. It was the fear that if just one country fell to communism, it would trigger a chain reaction, toppling all its neighbors one by one, exactly like a row of dominoes. And this specific mindset is what directly transformed the Cold War from a tense political standoff over in Europe into actual devastating bloodshed in Asia. The real-world consequences of this domino theory were just devastating. Paralyzed by the fear of a direct nuclear exchange, the superpowers started engaging in indirect proxy wars. Take Korea, for example. 3 years of brutal fighting left the borders exactly where they started, but it cost over 2 million Korean and 36,000 American lives. Later, in Vietnam, an American military strategy that was designed for fighting tank battles in Europe proved completely disastrous against guerrilla tactics in the jungle. This cost millions more lives, all driven by that underlying strategic fear of those dominoes falling. This brings us to part 3 of the explainer, mutually assured destruction, appropriately abbreviated as MAD. Now, While these proxy wars were raging, a terrifying new doctrine was taking over the grand strategy, MAD, or mutually assured destruction. The concept is that if you launch your nuclear weapons, the other side will detect them and launch theirs before yours even land. The result? Everyone dies. Total annihilation. Now, as completely insane as this strategy sounds on paper, it actually worked. Because the guaranteed outcome of pushing the red button was your own total destruction, leaders on both sides became highly motivated to never, ever push it. But man, we came shockingly close. Just look at this number, 13. That's the number of minutes it would take for Soviet nuclear missiles to reach Washington, D.C. after being secretly placed in Cuba by Soviet leader Khrushchev in 1962. When American spy planes spotted those missile sites, it triggered, without a doubt, the most dangerous standoff in all of human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. During this crisis, as the U.S. imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, tensions were literally at a boiling point beneath the ocean's surface. A cut-off Soviet submarine deep underwater and being hit by American warning depth charges completely lost communication with Moscow. The air conditioning broke, temperatures inside the sub soared over 100 degrees, and the exhausted Soviet captain, fully believing World War III had already started up on the surface, demanded they launch their 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo to at least go out saving their naval pride. Here's where the story gets crazy. Launching that torpedo required the unanimous consent of 3 commanding officers. The captain said yes, the political officer said yes, but a man named Vasily Arkhipov said no. A single, exhausted man in a boiling hot submarine literally stood between humanity and nuclear Armageddon. He argued that they didn't know for sure a war had started, and he firmly demanded they wait to surface and contact Moscow. He held his ground, the sub eventually surfaced, and the crisis was diffused. It's a wildly close call. Following that near apocalypse, we enter part 4, the final strategic moves and the endgame of this decades-long chess match. The path to resolving all of this was a roller coaster. It started with Détente in the 70s, basically a temporary relaxation of tensions, but that completely died when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, walking right into their own draining, disastrous guerrilla war. Then, Ronald Reagan takes office and launches a massive military buildup, including a wild proposed space-based defense system. The Soviets, who were already dealing with a severely failing economy, just simply couldn't afford to keep up the pace. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev, who desperately tried to save the Soviet system by introducing economic restructuring and political openness. Seizing on this massive shift in momentum, Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin and delivered this incredibly famous challenge. It wasn't just a speech, it was a strategic dare to let Eastern Europe finally breathe again. It perfectly combined relentless military and economic pressure with a loud, undeniable ideological demand for freedom. Now, what's fascinating is that Gorbachev's reforms essentially hit a self-destruct button on Soviet control. It's like the dominoes began falling all over again, but this time in reverse. Poland held elections, Hungary opened its borders, and East Germans famously flooded the checkpoints, climbing up to literally dance on the Berlin Wall. And the biggest key to all of this, unlike previous Soviet leaders who would have violently crushed these uprisings, Gorbachev made the pivotal decision to break from Stalin's old playbook. He flat out refused to send in the tanks. He just stepped back and let the empire peacefully unravel. And honestly, just like that, the Cold War was over. The Soviet flag was lowered for the last time in 1991, quietly replaced by the Russian flag. This mind-blowing 45-year conflict ended with one of the superpowers just simply ceasing to exist. It proved that a war that defined the entire globe could actually end purely through internal reform, strategic economic pressure, and crucially, a refusal to resort to ultimate violence at the very end. Which leaves us with this chilling final thought as we wrap up today's explainer. The Cold War might be history, but those core strategies, containment, proxy conflicts, and technological arms races, they're still very real concepts in play today. So we have to ask ourselves, will we learn from the people who managed to keep their fingers off the red button, or are we destined to play this incredibly high-stakes game all over again? Thanks for hanging out with me for this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.